All right, welcome back to another lecture. This week is Hindu philosophy and Hindu political thought, and we're going to study the work of Sri Aurobindo. And this reading is very different from the readings from the last 2 weeks. This week, we're going to be thinking about the state as not so much the instrument that makes us good, but the instrument that destroys our freedom. It destroys our soul, our individuality, and it creates uniformity, which is not necessarily a good thing in the sense of living out what we think is beautiful and so forth. So Aurobindo is very different from the previous scholars that we've looked at. And so there's a couple of things of note. If you look at your handy dandy study guide, you have Sri Aurobindo and the state, individual freedom, diversity in unity, the meaning of ideal, nations versus states, and how might one replace the state. So Aurobindo is a very, very different category when it comes to this idea of individualism and the state. So previously we talked about how the state creates good behavior. In this particular junction, in this philosopher, he's going to speak about how the state takes away from our happiness and our freedom. So if you look at the readings, I know there are a lot, but that's because of the writing style. The writing style is very flowery, and so it's difficult to cut to the chase of what we need to extract. But again, look through this, listen to this lecture, and try to pick up on those points, and then go about, do the reading, and then come back and listen to the lecture. I think that will be a great way to do things. So when we think about Sri Aurobindo, we have to understand first and foremost that the state is not necessarily the way in which people naturally organize themselves. So if you look at the on page 90, the second paragraph, which starts in the relations. So in the relations between the individual and the group, this constant tendency of nature appears as a strife between two equally deep-rooted human tendencies, individualism and collectivism. On one side is the engrossing authority, perfection, and development of the state, and on the other, the distinctive freedom, perfection, and development of the individual man. So there is perfection in both abstract entities, the individual and the state, but the state is really this force that creates a one distinct human being. So the state creates this idea of one person rather than people. So the state is sort of like a potter that shapes the pot, and there's no real individuality there. So one cannot truly be free within the state, according to Sri Aurobindo. So there is a strife between the individual and the collective. So when we speak of that, of Sri Aurobindo, we have to understand that man is free, but he also seeks to survive. And so we take solace with the group because survival is important. We need to join forces with other people so that we can preserve ourselves. But then this generates this idea of collectivism, and it creates uniformity. And so there's very little variation between individuals within that group. And so that creates a specific type of person. And then that ultimately erodes away at the individuality. So uniformity the state or the collective creates a uniformity that may or may not be friendly or helpful to the freedom of the individual. So because we seek to survive, right, we seek out a collective, and that collective then generates a sort of uniformity of behavior and of being. And so to defy that uniformity means that you don't fit in with the group, and that might create oppression or this need to ensure that there's uniformity. And that's the essential notion of the state according to Sri Aurobindo. And so when we think about that, when we think about the state suppresses the individual because it is in the interest of the state to do so, because the state demands uniformity, right? So you don't have, you basically have a tyranny of the majority over the individual. And so that is the paradox of human nature, as Sri Aurobindo says, because when you join the state to escape oppression, but yet the state oppresses you. That's the whole notion of Sri Aurobindo, right? Of his additions to the ideas of political philosophy. So what is the state? The state is simply a collective of individuals who seek to survive. But the state, as an organized community, destroys the individual and destroys destroys individualism. And so when you think about, when you read Sri Aurobindo and you go back to the first 2 points, Sri Aurobindo on the state and individual freedom, you begin to establish this pattern. So the state serves a purpose, but it's not freedom, it's not individual freedom. So there is this dichotomy between the state and the individual when it comes to safety of the collective and the freedom, right? Freedom that you don't have. If you can have complete freedom, but you're on your own, says Sri Aurobindo, or does he? We're going to see what his conclusions are. So the moral goodness of the previous scholars, Aurobindo would disagree, and he says, well, yeah, I mean, it might generate some goodness, but suppose you don't fit into that society, right, of what is good. Like, then you're going to be oppressed because you're not good. You're seen as not good. And so that's what Sri Aurobindo calls the great organized sham, right? That men yield to everything that is habitual and makes the present atmosphere of their lives so. Ultimately, then, what does he try to say? What is he trying to say? He's saying the state is inadequate. The state is a clumsy convenience. It doesn't achieve the goals. And never through history does the state achieve any goal, because what is the state other than the very entity that pursues war and conflict in the international system? Right? That's the whole the promise of this state. It's a very clumsy one. And on page 298, he says, the organized state is neither the best mind of the nation, nor is it even the sum of the communal energy. It leaves out of its organized action and suppresses or unduly depresses the working force and the thinking mind of important minorities, often of those which represent that which is best in the present. So this idea that, by being an oppressive regime or entity, it disposes of the good. So it destroys the good in its very need to seek security within that communal energy. This is, of course, remember, this is part of the Hindu philosophy, the Hindu tradition. So to Sri Aurobindo, the state is an entity which, with the greatest amount of power, is the least hampered by internal scruples or external checks. It has no soul, or only a rudimentary one. It is a military, political, and economic force. So it doesn't promote human freedom. It doesn't promote human happiness. It actually does the opposite. It oppresses, right? That's what Sri Aurobindo's critique is all about, right? So what then is the state? Does it promote human freedom? And Aurobindo says no. The state does not have a soul. The state is soulless. Individuals have souls, right? We have internal checks. We know what we're doing when we're doing something. We know that we're doing if it's wrong, or we know that it's good. The soul, the state does not have that soul. So the state is power. Power. There's no internal checks. It has a military. It has an economy. The individual has a soul. The individual has these internal checks. So what is the state? The state is a corrupting force. That is what Aurobindo is trying to say. So the state kills the individual. And the state kills the individual so that the individual can live in a safe way. This is something we're going to explore in week 14 in Agamben's work, but we'll get to that shortly. So Aurobindo is arguing that in order to have safety and security, humanity created the state, but that state is, as he says on page 300, a convenience and a rather clumsy one, right? It's a clumsy convenience. It's a human invention. It was created to fulfill a certain goal, but that goal in and of itself destroys individualism and leads to harmful outcomes from time to time. On page 301, he says, the first paragraph, the new paragraph on page 301, the state is bound to act crudely and in the mass. It is incapable of that free, harmonious, and intelligently or indistinctly varied action which is proper to organic growth. So in order for you to grow as a person or as anything, in order for you to grow, you can't conform to a static set of rules. As Aurobindo says, the state tends always to uniformity because uniformity is easy to it and natural variation is impossible to its essentially mechanically nature. But uniformity is death, not life, right? And so that's the whole, it's a corrupting force. It's a clumsy convenience. It's not what is natural to us as individuals of human beings. And so the first task of Aurobindo, his first task is to get people to understand that unification of mankind within the state through a collective egoism can destroy the individual. It's crushing. You're crushing the free spirit. You're crushing the free life of the individual, right? And you are limiting progress, human progress, and the strong beginnings of a moral and spiritual oneness. So the state essentially destroys the very distinct nature of people. Now, he says the state. He does not say the nation. A nation is a collective people, a collective unit of humanity, right? The state is not that. So there's a difference between the state and the nation. So the nation can be considered as a family of people that have something in common. The state is very different. The state is a military entity that produces uniformity of behavior. In the nation, there's something that makes people, have something in common, like language. Germany, or in the United States, the nation, the American nation, is one that believes in limited government, private property, the pursuit of happiness through that property, the right to life and liberty, to pursue your own goals the way you see it. As long as you don't harm anybody, that's your right. That is the American nation. It's not the American state. So there's a distinct difference, according to Aurobindo, between the nation and the state. And so when the nation persists, it persists because it unifies against outside threats. The state may be destroyed, but the nation persists, according to Aurobindo, and that is the case. A nation can exist without a state. It's a living group unit. So Poland has existed, Polish people has existed, Polish entity, the Polish nation existed even when their state was destroyed, and that happened 3 times in its history. You have the Palestinian nation and the Catalonian nation, you have the Kurdish nation, and they all exist independent of the state. So Aurobindo is saying that you can have nations without the state, and it's indeed the case. He says on page 306, new paragraph, this truth of a real unity is so strong that even nations which never in the past realized an outward unification in the state, to which fate and circumstance and their own selves have been adverse, nations which have been full of centrifugal forces and easily overpowered, yet always developed a force well and arrived inevitably at an organized oneness. So you can achieve oneness with a nation independent of the state. And so the unification of mankind through political and administrative means throughout a state has been done, but it's not necessarily something that needs to be done. So what does Aurobindo say? What does he suggest? What he's like, because he's identifying the problem that the state hurts, the state destroys the individual. That's clear. That's very clear. What does he recommend? Well, he says that we need to promote individualism. We need to promote diversity in the state by letting people be free. So loosening up the state apparatus so that we can be free people. And this freedom is something that generates goodness. Don't forget that. The whole point of freedom is so that we can find and progress as the human race. And so the state, because it generates uniformity of behavior, it inhibits the ability of people to find solutions. And so for Aurobindo, what he's trying to say is that uniformity hurts that, but what we need is unity. We need people to come together, to see that they're part of this wider evolutionary idea of nature, and that nature and the ideals that unify us might allow us to see beyond the states that we belong to, so we transcend the state. And so that's very important. So this first sentence on page 423, there is a struggle and opposition of ideas, impulses and interests, an attempt of each to profit by various kinds of war on the others. This is the aspect of life which humanity, in its highest thought and aspiration, knows that it has to transcend. It now endeavors instead to get rid of strife and the disorders of growth by a strong subordination or servitude of the life of the individual to the life of the community, and logically it will be led to the attempt to get rid of strife between communities. So in order to promote freedom, you're going to have to promote unity. And to promote unity, you're going to have to start thinking about the things that separate and come together in freedom. And so freedom is necessary for life, and that will help us create that spirit to help sort of destroy the influences of uniformity, that the thing that generates the state that generates that uniformity. And because of that, we will benefit our society as a whole. And so unity and uniformity are very, very different, and they're distinct in that sense. So what is the ideal solution? Like in the study guide, what does he mean by ideal? Ideal in the very sense of what should be. So Aurobindo knows that this idea of removing the state is an idealistic one. It's not pragmatic. Like, imagine living without the United States, or any state for that matter. How would we survive? Suppose we get attacked by a tribe or some other state that didn't, decide to just get rid of it. Then what? So that's why it's so important to understand that when Aurobindo says it's an ideal idea, what he means it's not immediately practicable. It's not practical in its immediate sense. So if you take a look at 427, new paragraph, though the ideal may not be immediately practicable, it is that to which our action ought more and more to move. And if the best method cannot always be employed, it is well to know the best method, so that in the strife of principles and forces and interests, something of it may enter into our dealings with each other and mitigate the errors, stumblings, and sufferings which our ignorance and unreason compel us to pay as a price of our progress. So what he's saying here is that in order to pursue a harmonious life with everyone, we're going to have to start thinking about alternatives to organizing ourselves. That's the important addition here to that Aurobindo is trying to get us to think, right? And I understand, like, this is a very hard thing to grasp, and I don't agree with it fully. I see what he's trying to say. He says that the state hurts our freedom, and in many ways it does. It generates a uniformity. I agree with that. And maybe it inhibits progress. Maybe if you think of a problem like undocumented people, right, as they try to seek a better life, it's very difficult for them. That border hurts their ability to seek a better life. But in many ways, we need that border because it enhances security. Because we need to know who's going in, who's going out, whether or not these people are enemies of the state and of the people. And so that's why we need a border. But that border hurts human freedom. It's essential that we understand that this distinction be made, right? We have to understand that the state is indeed very important, but it does have some drawbacks. But Aurobindo says that the idea is we start thinking about different ways. And so he says on page 248, in principle then, the ideal unification of mankind would be a system in which, as a first rule of common and harmonious life, the human peoples would be allowed to form their own groupings according to the natural divisions of locality, race, culture, economic convenience, and not according to the more violent accidents of history. The state, that's a violent act of history. So he's saying we don't need the state. We can start forming voluntary communities. And these voluntary communities, these free and natural groupings, which we will join, we were not compelled to join, but which we can join if we want to. And that will help promote collectivism, because he admits that we are people that need to have, we're political animals, we need to have those connections. We're not meant to be solitary. And so the first principle of human unity, these groupings should be a system of free and natural groupings which would leave no room for internal discord. If there is an internal discord, then you up and you leave, like you form your own community. That's the essential nature. It's a free and natural grouping that Aurobindo says is the very principle of human organization. So he says, Aurobindo diagnoses the problem, and he says the state's the problem, and he says this is not immediately practical. This is a very ideal suggestion, but maybe the answer is the formation of these involuntary communities that can help promote that human freedom that we we crave. And I think that's the whole essence of Aurobindo. And throughout his work, his reasoning, is very, it's rooted in history. It's rooted in what I would call evidence, Like he's trying to drive this idea, and he's trying to convince us that, yeah, we need to start thinking outside of that, outside of the state. And I mean, this idea of the uniformity that hurts human freedom, that can be arranged in a different way. So the state only came to existence in 1648. That's when the modern nation state was invented. So we can figure out a different way to order ourselves, says Aurobindo. And again, to repeat, he says this is not immediately practical. But there's one thing he says, that it has to be something from the bottom up. The individual has to form these communities. It can't be a world government, because if a world government is formed, it's going to be top down. It's going to be one that has a specific construct of how to behave, and that produces uniformity. And he says we don't want to go back to that. So instead of having a world state, we need a world union. So a world union formed by this confederation of voluntary communities. And so to escape, we need to start organizing and thinking of different ways to organize ourselves within these distinct communities. And so, to wrap everything up, if you look at page 508 and then page 512, you get that very thing. It's like, democracy is by no means a sure preservative of liberty. On the contrary, we see today the democratic system of government march steadily towards an organized annihilation of individual liberty, as could not have been dreamed of in the old aristocratic and monarchical systems. As we see in the fascist week, because Aurobindo was writing within that specific time, fascism grew out of democracy. And so this idea of people favoring or calling for a tyrant, or calling for somebody like Mussolini, accepting them, and Hitler as well, just accepting that, and accepting this destruction of our individual rights and freedoms. He says that democracy is not prone to this consolidation of of the state, but rather, it doesn't help us. It doesn't protect our individualism. In many ways, it destroys our individualism. And again, he was writing for a very particular time. And so what he's trying to say is that the state, in essence, is prone to the destruction of the individual. And that's what he says on page 12. To stop the destruction at its root, or else consent to its own subversion, would be the only alternatives before the established power. So what that means is that the static order of society is a necessary consequence, but freedom, without the freedom of the individual, a society cannot remain progressive. So the state produces uniformity, and within the collective, you need to be part of this collective. And if you don't subscribe, then you'll be forced to subscribe. So the individual is destroyed. And what he's saying, that rather than continue with the state, people need to start thinking outside that and think of different alternatives to the state, that which promotes human freedom. And Aurobindo says we should form voluntary communities to enhance that particular goal. So I know this was a very difficult read. I really hope you got through it. I've enjoyed Aurobindo. I've read him several times. This particular book is very important as a critique. And of course, it's not immediately practical, but it's important as an intellectual exercise. After all, this is political theory, to start thinking about these things and enjoying it, even though it's difficult. Thank you.